Hello and welcome to Indus News Live with me, Usman Lone. We begin this hour with our top story, and that's Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan warning Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi that his fascist agenda will have a negative impact on the region. Speaking in Islamabad, Khan says Modi's extremist ideology is aimed at marginalizing Indian Muslims. The Prime Minister says Pakistan will continue extending political and diplomatic support to the Kashmiri people. Khan went on to say that he will continue to raise his voice for Kashmiris at every international forum. The occupied valley has been under a curfew and communications blackout now for 148 days. Well, social media giant Facebook has blocked the Pakistan Broadcasting Corporation's live stream for highlighting human rights abuses in occupied Kashmir. The valley is under an Indian-composed clampdown for the last 48 days, and state media reports that the social media platform alleged the transmission violated its community standards. The Pakistani government and media have been raising their voices for the occupied valley at all platforms, including the UN, the EU and the OIC. India has amended its Army Act to appoint its outgoing Chief of Army Staff, General Bipin Rawat, as the Chief of Defence Staff. The amendments allowed the extension of services for any general officer to be appointed as the Chief of Defence. The retirement age of the Chief of Defence has also been stretched to 65 years. This comes just a day before Mr. Rawat's retirement. Well, in a related development, foreign diplomats in India have expressed concern and unease over the Modi government's controversial Citizenship Act. Speaking to media, the envoy said a recent event suggests New Delhi is intolerant of criticism and dissent. The diplomats went on to say that New Delhi has not briefed them on the law. They said the bill and the police crackdown on protesters have made their countries question India's commitment to its shared values. Earlier, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and Bangladesh's foreign and home ministers cancelled trips to India because of the unrest. 27 people have now been killed across the country in protests against the new law, which is seen as anti-Muslim. Now to Afghanistan, where a Taliban attack on a security checkpoint kills 14 soldiers and wounds 5 others in Jawzjan province. Officials say 13 members of a pro-government militia and a policeman were among the victims. The attack came as Taliban officials denied reports of a nationwide ceasefire agreed upon by their council members. Yesterday, a US news agency reported that the Taliban agreed to a temporary ceasefire in Afghanistan. But Taliban spokesperson Suhail Shaheen declared the reports as false and denied the peace agreement was made. He added if any such action will be taken, its details will be shared with the public and the world's media. Now, at a meeting with Russia's foreign minister in Moscow, Iran's foreign minister Javad Zarif says the United States is disturbing peace in the Gulf region. He was referring to the US airstrikes on a pro-Iranian militia in Iraq and Syria that killed at least 25 fighters yesterday. The two leaders reiterated their desire to maintain peace in the region. Mr. Zarif said the recent Iran-Russia-China joint military drills were also aimed at strengthening security in the region. Tensions between Iran and America increased last year when the US withdrew itself from the JCPOA deal and imposed sanctions on Iran. Well, from Iran to Iraq now, where the oil ministry said operations have resumed at the Nasiriyah oil field. Production was halted on Saturday after protesters broke into the oil field, which produces over 8,000 barrels of oil a day. The oil ministry said 2 more days will be required for output to be fully restored. It said the shutdown did not affect Iraq's exports. The ministry said additional output from southern oil fields in Basra was used to compensate for the missing shipments. Over 450 people have now been killed since mass protests began in Iraq on the 1st of October. Now, as Turkey has expressed willingness to send troops into Libya, France and Egypt have called on competing sides in the war-torn country and the international community to exercise restraint and avoid escalating the conflict further. In a phone call, President Emmanuel Macron discussed the Libyan crisis with Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and he criticized the newly agreed maritime accord between Turkey and Libya. Libya has been in turmoil since longtime ruler Muammar Gaddafi was ousted from power in 2011. In the chaos that followed, the country has been divided, with a weak UN-supported administration in Tripoli and a rival government in the east. Israel has decided to withhold $43 million in tax handovers to Palestine. Tel Aviv claims Palestinians have used the funds to support the families of slain or wounded militants. The total amount of money withheld now equals 7% of tax funds due to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinians say the payments are needed to help vulnerable families affected by violence and the Israeli occupation. Under interim peace deals, Israel collects taxes on behalf of Palestinians. With diplomacy stalled since 2014, Israel has at times withheld money as a measure of protest or pressure. North Korea has called for positive and offensive measures to safeguard the country's sovereignty and security ahead of a year-end deadline for talks with the US. State media reports leader Kim Jong-un suggested action in foreign affairs, the defense industry and the armed forces. Kim led a weekend meeting of senior Workers' Party officials to discuss policy during rising regional tensions. State media reported the leader also discussed state management and economic issues. It said he called for the grave state of industrial sectors of the national economy to be urgently corrected. Earlier, US National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said the situation in North Korea is a dangerous and a cause of concern. UN Security Council members will meet informally today in the second round of negotiations on a joint Russian-Chinese proposal to lift sanctions on North Korea. Beijing and Moscow are setting up negotiations a day before North Korea's deadline for the US to show flexibility in stalled denuclearization talks. A Security Council diplomat has accused Russia and China of coordinating the draft resolution with North Korea. The two veto-wielding powers say they hope lifting some sanctions could help break the deadlock and encourage talks between Washington and Pyongyang. But the US, France and Britain say now is not the time to lift those sanctions. Bolivia's interim president Jeanine Áñez says the country will expel Mexico's ambassador and two other Spanish diplomats. Áñez ordered Mexican ambassador Maria Teresa Mercado and two Spanish officials to leave the country within 72 hours. Meanwhile, Mexico's foreign ministry instructed its ambassador in Bolivia to return to ensure her safety. Earlier, Mexico moved the International Criminal Court to ensure the safety of its diplomatic facilities in Bolivia. Bilateral relations became tense after Mexico gave political asylum to former Bolivian President Evo Morales last month. In Sudan, a court has sentenced 27 intelligence agents to death for torturing and killing a protester earlier this year. This is the first time in Sudan's history that it's handed down convictions over crackdowns on anti-government demonstrations. The court said the protester was a teacher who was arrested by intelligence operatives in January. The court has given defense lawyers 2 weeks to appeal against the death sentences. Anti-government protests erupted in Sudan over high bread prices that forced former President Omar al-Bashir to step down in April. In Somalia, 4 al-Shabaab militants have been killed in US airstrikes. In a statement, the US Africa Command said it carried out 3 airstrikes in the vicinity of Kunya, Barao and Kaliyo, Barao. It said the raids were carried out with the Somalian government targeting militants who had attacked innocent civilians. The strikes came after a truck bombing in Mogadishu killed at least 80 people. US strikes in Somalia surged after President Donald Trump declared the country's southern territory an area of active hostiles. Well, we've got more news to come and it'll be here right after this short break, so do stay with us. Hello again, it's good to have you back. Now in Australia, a volunteer firefighter in New South Wales has died, with more than 100 bushfires still burning across the continent. At least 10 people have been killed in the bushfires so far. The volunteer died and 2 others suffered burns when their truck was overturned by extreme winds during the raging fire. The blaze is also killing native fauna and driving animals out of the bushland into people's homes. In the meantime, tens of thousands of residents in southwestern Victoria state have been told to evacuate their homes. The fires have destroyed 4 million hectares in 5 states since September this year. Now, in a bout of bitter cold sweeping across Pakistan as temperatures plunge below zero in many areas, the Pakistan Meteorological Department recorded the temperature at minus 21 degrees Celsius in northern Skardu, breaking a 25-year-old record. The department said water bodies in Skardu have frozen and intermittent snowfall has blocked the city's main connecting roads. Meanwhile, temperatures in Astor city was recorded at minus 7 and in Hunza minus 5, while the capital Islamabad was held at 4 degrees Celsius. The department said dense fog will continue to disrupt air, rail and road traffic. Well, staying in Pakistan, an air quality has varied between bad and hazardous in 223 days of this year. Tired of choking on putrid and polluted air, people have taken up the challenge to beat the smog by developing their own purifiers. There's more about their struggle in this report.
Pakistan has just experienced its worst smog crisis this winter. The poor air quality has put tens of thousands of people at risk of respiratory disease.
Pakistan is facing problems, especially Lahore and around the city of Lahore. That is, you can say maximum 250 quality index pollution level.
Research by Gates Foundation suggests that 125,000 people die each year in Pakistan because of air pollution. Taking things into his own hands, activist Hassan Zaidi has produced homemade, low-cost devices to cope with the toxic smog. The domestically designed purifiers are cheaper than imported models.
To start with, it was originally designed to just serve my own purpose. But I saw that a lot of people were asking me about them and awareness was growing nationwide.
Public awareness of the issue is growing, fueled by increased activism on social media about the twin menaces of climate change and air pollution.
The United Nations say millions of children across the world are entering a new decade having faced the devastating consequences of violence in conflict zones. The United Nations Children Agency UNICEF said it documented 170,000 violations against minors since 2010. It said the violations include killing, maiming, abduction, sexual abuse and recruitment into armed groups. UNICEF's Executive Director N.KOREA said the attacks on children and young people continue unabated, with combatants ignoring the rules of war. Now, 2019 was a consequential year in several ways. Many events took place that could shape the world in the coming decade. These included the rise of Islamophobic terrorism, government ousters by angry protesters, and India's escalation on the line of control. We take a look back at this year's events in this report.
Terrorism emerged as a threat to people everywhere once again in 2019. The Easter Sunday bombings in Sri Lanka conducted by ISIS were the deadliest terrorist incident of the year. 259 people were killed and over 500 injured in separate bomb blasts in 3 churches and 3 hotels. In New Zealand, the Christchurch terror attack revealed the dangers of unbridled Islamophobia. 51 people were shot dead at the Al Noor Mosque and Linwood Islamic Centre by a white supremacist Australian national. The heinous attack was live-streamed on Facebook. In occupied Kashmir, India illegally revoked the valley's special status as a disputed territory on the 5th of August. To force the local population into compliance with the move, New Delhi shut down communications and put the valley under curfew. The lockdown has been in effect since 5th of August and thousands of Kashmiris have been arrested. People across the world also rose up against government corruption and oppression. There were violent protests in Hong Kong against a now revoked extradition bill that remains ongoing today. Similar protests were also held in Sudan, Lebanon, Bolivia and Iraq. In Lebanon and Sudan, the protesters successfully ousted their heads of state. The worrying symptoms of climate crisis also became more apparent than ever. Massive heat waves killed over 180 people in India and over 160 in Japan. Changing weather patterns were also blamed for typhoons in Africa, Japan and China. The worst was Cyclone Idai in southeastern Africa, which killed over 1,000 people and caused damages worth over $2 billion. In a major setback in the fight against climate change, almost 100,000 hectares of Amazon rainforest in Brazil were destroyed in wildfires that started in January and remain ongoing today. Wildfires also caused significant damage in the US, Indonesia and Australia. These were some of the biggest events of the year and are likely to have major consequences for the next decade.
Well, there was little improvement in the lives of those living in conflict zones this year as well, be it in Afghanistan, Ukraine, Libya, Yemen or the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the Sahel region in Africa. Thousands lost their lives in armed conflicts. The situation was no different in the Middle East, with over 1,000 people killed in Syria. Israel continued its blockade of Gaza Strip in Palestine, killing over 200 people and wounding about 6,000. Tensions also rose in the Persian Gulf after Iran shot down a US drone in June. Indus News looks back at 2019 with all of these stories in this report.
There were some moments this year when warring parties in several armed conflicts were close to reaching a truce. But such a development didn't come to pass. The United States and the Taliban were on the cusp of a landmark ceasefire deal in Afghanistan. But US President Donald Trump abruptly called off talks in September after the killing of a US soldier in the war-torn country. The two sides are now negotiating to find a political settlement in Afghanistan once more. In March, US President Donald Trump declared victory against ISIS militants in Syria. 5 months later, Turkey launched a military operation against the Syrian Democratic Forces, which was a US ally in the fight against ISIS. The operation was halted after Turkey made 2 separate accords with the US and Russia. But the bloodshed in Syria continues as Russian and the government forces intensified bombardment in Idlib, forcing tens of thousands to flee the region. The 5-year-long conflict between the Houthi rebels and the government coalition forces in Yemen continue to make headlines throughout the year. Diplomatic efforts are underway for a ceasefire deal to end the war, which has been described by the UN as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Tensions around the Persian Gulf remained heightened due to a series of attacks on naval vessels in the key shipping route. In North Africa, Libya is still struggling to find peace 8 years after the fall of a longtime dictator, Muammar al-Gaddafi, in 2011. The situation went from bad to worse after warlord Khalifa Haftar's forces waged an offensive against the UN-recognized government over control of Tripoli. In Africa's Sahel region, increasing attacks and the collaboration between armed groups caused hundreds of deaths and forced thousands to seek safety in the camps. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, militant attacks hampered efforts to tackle an ongoing Ebola outbreak. Aid workers struggled to contain the catastrophe as they and their camps came under repeated militant attacks. Over 2,200 people have died in the Ebola epidemic. Nearly 2 billion people live in fragile conflict zones across the world, driving more than 80% of the world's humanitarian needs. More efforts are needed to improve the lives of the people and to make the world more peaceful.
In Germany, 170 flights have been cancelled by cabin crew strikes at Lufthansa's budget airline Germanwings. The cabin crew union, UFO, yes, they're called UFO, it's not an alien, had announced strikes from Monday to Wednesday in a bid to pressurize the management over wage talks. Lufthansa said 15% of Eurowings flights had to be axed. A UFO spokesman said at first 35 flights were cancelled, then 54 and now 170. He said it should be a clear sign to Lufthansa, highlighting the degree of employee anger. The majority of the cancelled flights were domestic in between Germany. Well, it's a chilly 5 degrees here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that's all from me and the team here in Lahore, but we'll be back at the top of the hour with the headlines. And don't forget, for the latest updates on all of our stories, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News. Thank you for watching and bye-bye.